Well, welcome to a new podcast series called Turning Points. And each week I'm going to be talking to someone who has had some major incidents in their life. So major, in fact, that it's caused their lives to turn in one way or another. And I'm delighted this evening to be interviewing Jan. And in fact, Jan's going to have 2 episodes devoted to her story and 2 incidents. One historical and the other more recent. So welcome, Jan.
Thank you.
I wonder, because I know you're going to talk about someone who's very dear to you and very close to you, I wonder if you would please tell us about the person who has influenced you and why, in the sense of their own story, first of all.
Well, I'm going to talk to you about my great-grandmother, a rather amazing woman, and I'm going to talk to you about the Senghenydd explosion, which was on the 14th of October, 1913. This explosion was, at the time, the largest pit explosion in the world, and in the UK, of course, and it took the lives of 439 men and boys, some as young as 13 years of age. There were only 18 survivors. My grandmother was one of the people who were influenced by this disaster. She lived in a cottage on Caerphilly Mountain called Tŷ Melyn House. There she raised her 9 children, and each evening the 3 eldest boys and my great-grandfather, who was in his early 40s, would walk across the mountains to the Senghenydd pit to work. There was no other option. There was very little work around at the time. So,
where did you say your where was their home, Jan?
On Caerphilly Mountain.
It was so they walked from Caerphilly Mountain right across. That's
yeah.
You know, today that's a long walk, isn't
Yes.
it? It's not a short walk.
Yes.
No.
But there was no work.
No.
You see. So they didn't have an option. So on the 14th of October, this loud siren shrieked across the valley, and everyone knew that something serious had happened. When my grandmother heard the news, she dressed her remaining children at home, dressed them and took them to chapel in Caerphilly. She learned that she had lost her husband and at that time 3 teenage sons, and that was Ernest, William and Trevor. It wasn't until it was 48 hours later that my grandmother learned that Trevor in fact had survived, but he was to remain unconscious for 9 months. He was severely burnt. She had had a great loss, and can you imagine waving off your husband and children off to school, as we all do, and never seeing them again? It's very hard to comprehend. So my inspiration came from this woman. There were no social workers in those days. There was no money, and she had to find a way forward. So she set about moving her house and getting a rented property in Caerphilly in Mill Road. As I say, the coal owners told her that if she remarried, the small allowance she would have would stop. And in fact, they told her to sell her piano, and she refused. Because the piano was a central part of family life in those days. It was a very important piece of furniture. So she set about rebuilding her life, and she took in a lodger into Mill Road to pay the rent. And I can remember going as a little girl to my great-grandmother's home and pulling back this heavy dark red velvet curtain with these rings, these brass rings on the top of a pole, and seeing this grey old man there who was the lodger. But he paid the rent. So things were very difficult and very tight financially, but she was determined that she was going to survive. She never showed a trace or never talked about the explosion and what happened or the feelings, other than to my mother, whom was later to come into the family and she was to bring up as her own. My grandmother's faith was profound, embedded in her. She would say to my mother, well, everybody depended on me, but then you see, I had someone looking after me. And I know who that was. And of course she was speaking about our Lord. And she was one of the most incredible people imaginable. And those remaining children, of course, wondered where their older brothers and their father was, but she carefully and tactfully sat them down and explained. And that must have been very difficult to very young children. But she never wavered. And she died at the age of 87 with my mother by her side. She brought my mother up as her own because one of her daughters had my mother out of wedlock. And in those days it was an absolute disgrace. But when my mother told me, I just said to her, look, without you, there wouldn't be me nor my sister June. So I think she felt a lot better after that. But tragedy wasn't to leave her, because within a couple of years, her next eldest son, Hubert, was killed in France in the First World War. But I expect that by then she somehow was used to tragedy. Again, never discussed anything. And it was from the courage of this woman, in later years myself, that I was to draw upon that courage.
We'll come to that a little later on, Jan. But your grandmother sounds, or great-grandmother.
Yes.
I think,
yes.
as you found out, Great-Grandma Morgan.
Yes.
Sounds like an extraordinary woman. Because I can't even begin to, I'm not sure any of us can imagine that level of pain and level of loss to lose so many children and your husband, and all economically what that signified for her. But you say that she how did she keep going? I mean, that
her faith.
It was simply that, yes.
Never failed. Every Sunday was to chapel.
And did she talk about her faith much? Did she verbalise, what this meant to her?
No, I am being looked after.
Yeah.
That type of attitude. Remember, I was about 7 when she died.
Yeah.
So my memories of her are scones or doing big lumps of toast on these long pronged forks around a coal fire with black leading, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's going back a long time in my life. But I have to say, a pivotal, pivot.
Well, Jan, you painted a vivid picture of, and I can, I remember reading, I'm sure many have, reports of just that awful disaster in St Henry's, and I remember reading about the pit owners and just how callous that company was in relation to this loss. Claire and I lived in, our first home was in Abertydwr, Pringelli Terrace, and that's a very steep hill which runs down to the colliery, which is obviously it's the 1980s. It's just they built houses, some new houses on that mine now. But people have often remarked that, and it's visible today. I think there's a whole generation of men, if not 2 generations, that just aren't there.
No,
they just went
completely wiped out.
Yeah.
And I go to the memorial services, which are held every year. Couldn't go last year because of COVID, and it's very moving. And you can feel. You close your eyes, and you're at the pit head, where there's a big winder, and you can feel the emotion there. And as the little children come from the local school to sing in Welsh, a lot of it is in Welsh, it does bring tears to your eyes.
For those who have never been to it's a national memorial now, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Tell us about what it is. If anybody visited there, what they'd likely to see. We'll try and put some pictures up. I can see you've got some photographs. I'll see if I can put some of those up.
You can see here, it's a spacious sort of paved circle. And the memorial founders wrote to descendants of the miners to ask if they wanted to buy a plaque. So that's what we did as a family, representing each person, child that died. And in the centre of this circle is a bronze statue of a miner actually pulling a colleague behind him out of the pit. Yes, it's a very moving setting, and actually there is an irony to this story, is that it was one day when I was staring at the plaque of my family that a gentleman said, "Oh, you know that man, do you?" And I said, "Yes, I do." I said, "That was my great-grandfather." And he said, "Well, I must be a relative of yours then." And it turned out to be a gentleman whom I later met as well, who was a descendant of Mary Ann Moses. Her mother, Anne Watkins, was a descendant of this man. So it's strange how life works, isn't it?
Yeah. But, and I noticed there that it says on the memorial, the address is given as, I think it's T. Mellin, the Black Cock, which is, of course, it's still there, the Black Cock Public House. Just as you're right, it's just a little hill that runs down from Caerphilly Mountain.
There's a roadway opposite the Black Cock.
Yes.
And you go down the bottom of that, and there it is, T. Mellin.
And it's down there. Yeah.
That's where they were raised, the family. And in fact, my mother's mother, went to live back on the mountain afterwards, which No, we used to go up every Sunday afternoon after chapel. So yeah.
So it's a custom of yours now as a family, I guess, to go to the annual memorial.
Yes.
And is that a religious ceremony? Is it what happens on that day? Well, children sing from the local school.
Yes, and that the head girl and head boy from the grammar school on Caerphilly Mountain, as you go up, they go and they read poetry, and then you've got the counsellors there and the dignitaries of Caerphilly. And they all have something to say, and then they ask if you would like to lay flowers, and that's what we do. So it takes about an hour, the whole thing. Of course, when the centenary happened in 2013, I did do a broadcast with Roy Noble about my grandmother.
Okay.
And that was very moving.
And did Grandma Morgan ever remarry?
No.
No?
No. Priority, the children.
Yeah.
Yes.
And forgive me here, Jan, my terrible memory. So Grandma Morgan lost three sons and her husband, of course. Trevor was found 48 hours later.
Correct. Yes.
And so how many other children did she have beyond who remained, who survived, who lived?
Right. Well, 6 were left, including Trevor.
Wow.
Yeah.
So she was a phenomenal woman too.
Yes, and brought my mother up as well.
Yeah.
But always told my mother that she was the blessing in her life.
Yeah. Wow.
So she had sort of a lot of attention because she was this little baby amongst much older teenagers.
Gosh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
And my mother adored her.
Yeah.
And trips from Llanishen, where we were living,
yes,
to Philly, as I called it, Caerphilly, were every Saturday. And the whole family gathered there.
Yeah.
Everybody gathered together in a tiny terraced house.
In Mill Road.
Mill Road.
You know as well. Yeah. And Jan, you mentioned a bit earlier that Trevor himself has had quite a story.
Oh yes, goodness me.
Do you want to give us just a few little snapshots of Trevor? Because he was this miracle child who's plucked out of the depths of the earth alive.
If I can find him, here he is. Yes, I've got a newspaper cutting from my mother, which I found when Mum passed away, dated October the 18th, 1952. And Trevor, of course, was one of the 18 survivors. His father and 2 brothers lost their lives. And my mother's outlined the story here, that it took the Express reporter a very long time to find Trevor. But he was tucked away in a tiny cottage, Rose Cottage, on Caerphilly Mountain, Graig Goch, behind the mountain. And at this time he was 57 in 1952.
Right.
And he was the only one of the family working in the colliery at the time to survive, as I said. He found his father and 2 brothers dead. And his father was found alive but brought up too soon and died from the effects of being brought up too soon. Trevor Morgan was unconscious for 2 weeks after the explosion, and by the time he regained consciousness, his father and brothers had been buried. He spent 9 months in hospital as a result of burns from the explosion. He then went on this is incredible, Gethin, he went on to work on the surface of St Ennis Colliery after the explosion.
Oh, yeah.
And then he had the experience of another explosion at Rockwood Colliery in 1944, and he was injured again. And then twice he had to swim for his life when both pits in which he worked were flooded. And this happened at Bather Colliery and at Blackwood Colliery. He went on to serve 5 years with the Royal Artillery in India and Ireland. He now works for, what this paper's saying, he went on to work for the South Wales Forge Masters in Tafts Well. What an incredible man.
Yes.
To go back to the colliery
Yes.
that took the lives of your family.
Yeah.
I mean, psychologically,
Yeah. Yes.
how did he do that? Was it the lack of work that forced that?
Yeah. Well,
We
yes.
never know.
No. And I guess in these days, we know so much more about trauma and its effects on people, and there
Yes.
are, therapies available. I guess for your grandmother and her family, and for hundreds or thousands of others at that time,
Yeah.
let alone the wars, there was very little support other than, I suspect, local chapels and churches and
Yes.
faith and family. People probably just had to rely much more on each other for that basic comfort and
I think
support.
that's why families were very much closer. Because women didn't work because they relied on the men to find work, and I think there was a closer community.
Yes.
And it just leaves me speechless, really.
Yeah.
How on earth did they manage?
Yes.
But manage they did.
Yes.
And, the remaining children went on to do quite well. And I can remember one in particular, Uncle Glyndor, having an incredible sense of humour. This dark red hair, an incredible sense of humour, and a very loving individual
Yes.
who obviously embraced life
Yes. Yes.
for what it was,
Yes.
which was very simple.
Yes. Jan, thank you. Thank you for telling us the story of Grandma Morgan, and for painting such vivid pictures, and for taking us back to a 1913 in St Henith, that awful disaster, and how your great grandmother, in her own way, overcame these awful odds that were thrown against her
Through her faith.
through her faith.